Our final component of the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model is aggregate demand. This is the spending side of the economy. Aggregate means total. So our aggregate demand is our total spending within our economy. It's our total demand for all goods and services. To determine aggregate demand, we sum up different components of spending in the economy in the same way that we sum up different components of spending to calculate our GDP. In the long run, our output will be equal to our spending. So our output, our GDP, is going to be equal to our spending habits or our aggregate demand. Our aggregate demand is thus equal to our spending on C, consumption, I, investment, G, government expenditures, and NX, our net exports. Remember that C, consumption, is our consumer purchases of goods and services. So everything from pens to prepared tax forms. It's goods and services that consumers purchase. I is investment, and we can think of this as firms investing, firms purchasing resources in order to produce future output. G is government expenditures. So this is anything that the government has as additional expenditures, the same things that would count for G, government expenditures, in GDP calculations. That's what counts here for our aggregate demand. And the last thing is NX, and that stands for net exports. This is the net exports of an economy, or the net effect of foreign purchases on our demand. So aggregate demand is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX, in the same way that Y, output, is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX. In the aggregate supply aggregate demand model, the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. The aggregate demand curve indicates the various quantities of domestically produced goods and services that purchasers are willing to buy at different price levels. How much demand do we have at various different price levels for our goods and services, for our output? The aggregate demand curve slopes downward and to the right, indicating that we have this inverse relationship between the amount of goods and services demanded and the price level. When the price level goes down or declines, the quantity of goods and services will increase. It's inversely related. So when the price level goes down, the quantity goes up. In other words, the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. But why is the aggregate demand curve downward sloping? Why is it that when the price level drops, the quantity of aggregate demand actually increases? Aggregate demand is downward sloping for a different reason than the single market or microeconomic case of the demand curve being downward sloping. In the microeconomic case, one of the major reasons for the demand curve being downward sloping is that we substitute. If the price gets higher for apples, what we do is we simply substitute away from apples. We forego purchasing some apples because the price is too high. And instead, we consume pears, oranges, bananas. We substitute away to other goods. That logic cannot hold for the macroeconomy. The logic just simply doesn't work. Substituting out of apples and into pears would do nothing for the aggregate demand of an economy, the overall demand that we have. So there is not the same reason between microeconomics demand curve being downward sloping and macroeconomics aggregate demand curve being downward sloping. These aren't the same reasons. But there are three reasons why the aggregate demand curve slopes downward. And we're going to look at those three reasons here. Why is it that we have this negative relationship between the quantity of output and the price level? Why is aggregate demand downward sloping? The three reasons are going to be the wealth effect, the interest rate effect, and the international trade effect. We're going to look at those now. The first reason for the aggregate demand curve being downward sloping is associated with A.C. Pigou. It's called the wealth effect. The idea here is that the real wealth of people holding money will increase when the price level falls, which this encourages additional consumption, so we should increase the quantity that we overall demand. So the logic here is that the price level falls and I have some money. Stuff is now cheaper. That's what a price level falling means. But I have that same amount of money that I had before. So now I can buy more stuff. And so as the price level falls, the quantity of output that I would like to consume or purchase will go up. And so we have this negative relationship, or we can explain why the aggregate demand would be downward sloping. Second up is the interest rate effect associated with John Maynard Keynes. The idea here is that a fall in the demand for money at a lower price level reduces interest rates, which encourages investment and consumption. When the price level is low, consumers demand a relatively small amount of currency because it takes a relatively small amount of currency to make the purchases that they need to make. So if the price level is low, prices are really low, consumers are going to demand a relatively small amount of currency because they don't need as much. So after the price level drop, I can buy more, but I also don't need as much currency to buy what I want. So what happens is that consumers keep larger amounts of currency in the bank. As the amount of currency in banks increases, the supply of loanable funds in the loanable funds market moves out, and the number of loans increases. As the loanable funds supply curve moves out, the cost of loans, that is the interest rate, decreases. Lower interest rates allow for firms to invest more. I goes up. And it makes it cheaper for consumers to purchase goods on credit. So it spurs large-scale purchases. So it spurs C. With the interest rates lower, it spurs these large-scale purchases via loans so that consumption can increase. So if you're looking to buy a house or a car or things like that, C is going up with lower interest rates. And thus aggregate demand is pushed further out. So firms invest more, I goes up, and perhaps even C goes up some as large-scale purchases go up. So we have the interest rate effect here from Keynes. You get a fall in the demand for holding money, so you get an increase in supply at banks, an increase of supply at the loanable funds market, which reduces the interest rates and encourages investment and consumption. Consider the opposite story of what I just told. Imagine that the price level goes up. Say you live on a budget, and now everything's slightly more expensive. You have less money to save, less money to take to the bank, and thus the supply of loanable funds is going to decrease. It's going to move back into the left. This is going to increase the interest rate. So with a higher price level, you have less money to take to the bank because the stuff that you need to buy is more expensive. So you take less money to the bank, which reduces the supply of loanable funds, which increases the interest rate. Well, what does that interest rate do here? We have the interest rate effect story. A higher interest rate is going to reduce the amount of investment that firms make because now they have to borrow at more expensive terms. And also, individual consumers are going to buy fewer large-scale purchases that require borrowed funds, like a house or a car or something where you have to take out a loan to purchase that. So we get this negative relationship here between the price level and the output that is demanded for the overall aggregate economy. Finally, we have the international trade effect associated with the economists Mundell and Fleming. Net exports will expand because the prices of domestic goods have decreased if the price level falls. If our goods have gotten cheap relative to other goods, foreigners will buy more from us, demanding more of our products. This net exports ratio will become more positive as exports will go up relative to imports. Thus, our quantity of aggregate demand is expanding as that price level is dropping. As the price level falls, foreigners buy more of our goods, and so aggregate demand in terms of our output, in terms of our production that is demanded, will have expanded.